双语音标领航，注音阅读启蒙，叶兴阳有声读物。
Father Goriot by Honoré de Balzac. Translated by Ellen Marriage. To the great and illustrious Geoffrey St. Hilaire, a token of admiration for his works and genius. De Balzac. Madame Walker, née de Conflans, is an elderly person who for the past 40 years has kept a lodging house in the Rue Neuve, Sainte-Geneviève, in the district that lies between the Latin Quarter and the Faubourg Saint-Marcel. Her house, known in the neighborhood as the Maison Walker, receives men and women, old and young, and no word has ever been breathed against her respectable establishment. But, at the same time, it must be said that as a matter of fact no young woman has been under her roof for 30 years, and that if a young man stays there for any length of time it is a sure sign that his allowance must be of the slenderest. In 1819, however, the time when this drama opens, there was an almost penniless young girl among Madame Walker's boarders. That word drama has been somewhat discredited of late. It has been overworked and twisted to strange uses in these days of dolorous literature. But it must do service again here, not because this story is dramatic in the restricted sense of the word, but because some tears may perhaps be shed intra et extramuros before it is over. Will anyone without the walls of Paris understand it? It is open to doubt. The only audience who could appreciate the results of close observation, the careful reproduction of minute detail and local color, are dwellers between the heights of Montrouge and Montmartre, in a vale of crumbling stucco watered by streams of black mud, a vale of sorrows which are real and joys too often hollow. But this audience is so accustomed to terrible sensations that only some unimaginable and well-nigh impossible woe could produce any lasting impression there. Now and again there are tragedies so awful and so grand by reason of the complication of virtues and vices that bring them about, that egotism and selfishness are forced to pause and are moved to pity. But the impression that they receive is like a luscious fruit, soon consumed. Civilization, like the car of Juggernaut, is scarcely stayed perceptibly in its progress by a heart less easy to break than the others that lie in its course. This also is broken, and civilization continues on her course triumphant. And you, too, will do the like. You who with this book in your white hand will sink back among the cushions of your armchair, and say to yourself, perhaps this may amuse me. You will read the story of Father Goriot's secret woes, and, dining thereafter with an unspoiled appetite, will lay the blame of your insensibility upon the writer, and accuse him of exaggeration, of writing romances. Ah! Once for all, this drama is neither a fiction nor a romance. All is true, so true, that everyone can discern the elements of the tragedy in his own house, perhaps in his own heart. The lodging-house is Madame Walker's own property. It is still standing in the lower end of the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève, just where the road slopes so sharply down to the Rue de l'Arbalete that wheeled traffic seldom passes that way, because it is so stony and steep. This position is sufficient to account for the silence prevalent in the street shut in between the dome of the Pantheon and the dome of the Val de Grace. Two conspicuous public buildings which give a yellowish tone to the landscape and darken the whole district that lies beneath the shadow of their leaden-hued cupolas. In that district the pavements are clean and dry. There is neither mud nor water in the gutters. Grass grows in the chinks of the walls. The most heedless passer-by feels the depressing influences of a place where the sound of wheels creates a sensation. There is a grim look about the houses, a suggestion of a jail about those high garden walls. A Parisian straying into a suburb apparently composed of lodging-houses and public institutions would see poverty and dullness, old age lying down to die, and joyous youth condemned to drudgery. It is the ugliest quarter of Paris, and, it may be added, the least known. But, before all things, the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève is like a bronze frame for a picture for which the mind cannot be too well prepared by the contemplation of sad hues and sober images. Even so, step by step the daylight decreases. and the cicerone's droning voice grows hollower as the traveler descends into the catacombs. The comparison holds good. Who shall say which is more ghastly, the sight of the bleached skulls or of dried-up human hearts? The front of the lodging house is at right angles to the road, and looks out upon a little garden, so that you see the side of the house in section, as it were, from the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève. Beneath the wall of the house front there lies a channel, a fathom wide, paved with cobblestones, and beside it runs a gravelled walk bordered by geraniums and oleanders and pomegranates set in great blue and white glazed earthenware pots. Access into the gravelled walk is afforded by a door, above which the words Maison Vauquer may be read, and beneath, in rather smaller letters, lodgings for both sexes, etc. During the day a glimpse into the garden is easily obtained through a wicket to which a bell is attached. On the opposite wall, at the further end of the gravelled walk, a green marble arch was painted once upon a time by a local artist, and in this semblance of a shrine a statue representing Cupid is installed, a Parisian Cupid, so blistered and disfigured that he looks like a candidate for one of the adjacent hospitals, and might suggest an allegory to lovers of symbolism. The half-obliterated inscription on the pedestal beneath determines the date of this work of art, for it bears witness to the widespread enthusiasm felt for Voltaire on his return to Paris in 1777. Whoe'er thou art, thy master see, he is, or was, or ought to be. At night the wicket gate is replaced by a solid door. The little garden is no wider than the front of the house. It is shut in between the wall of the street and the partition wall of the neighboring house. A mantle of ivy conceals the bricks and attracts the eyes of passers-by to an effect which is picturesque in Paris, for each of the walls is covered with trellised vines that yield a scanty dusty crop of fruit, and furnish besides a subject of conversation for Madame Vauquer and her lodgers. Every year the widow trembles for her vintage. A straight path beneath the walls on either side of the garden leads to a clump of lime trees at the further end of it. Lime trees, as Madame Vauquer persists in calling them, in spite of the fact that she was a de Conflans, and regardless of repeated corrections from her lodgers. The central space between the walls is filled with artichokes and rows of pyramid fruit trees, and surrounded by a border of lettuce, potherbs, and parsley. Under the lime trees there are a few green-painted garden seats and a wooden table, and hither, during the dog days, such of the lodgers as are rich enough to indulge in a cup of coffee come to take their pleasure, though it is hot enough to roast eggs even in the shade. The house itself is 3 stories high, without counting the attics under the roof. It is built of rough stone, and covered with the yellowish stucco that gives a mean appearance to almost every house in Paris. There are 5 windows in each story in the front of the house. All the blinds visible through the small square panes are drawn up awry, so that the lines are all at cross purposes. At the side of the house there are but 2 windows on each floor, and the lowest of all are adorned with a heavy iron grating. Behind the house a yard extends for some 20 feet, a space inhabited by a happy family of pigs, poultry, and rabbits. The woodshed is situated on the further side, and on the wall between the woodshed and the kitchen window hangs the meat safe, just above the place where the sink discharges its greasy streams. The cook sweeps all the refuse out through a little door into the Rue Neuve Sainte-Geneviève, and frequently cleanses the yard with copious supplies of water, under pain of pestilence. The house might have been built on purpose for its present uses. Access is given by a French window to the first room on the ground floor, a sitting room which looks out upon the street through the 2 barred windows already mentioned. Another door opens out of it into the dining room, which is separated from the kitchen by the well of the staircase, the steps being constructed partly of wood, partly of tiles, which are colored and beeswaxed. Nothing can be more depressing than the sight of that sitting room. The furniture is covered with horsehair woven in alternate dull and glossy stripes. There is a round table in the middle, with a purplish-red marble top, on which there stands, by way of ornament, the inevitable white china tea service, covered with a half-effaced gilt network. The floor is sufficiently uneven, The wainscot rises to elbow height, and the rest of the wall space is decorated with a varnished paper, on which the principal scenes from Telemaque are depicted, the various classical personages being colored. The subject between the two windows is the banquet given by Calypso to the son of Ulysses, displayed thereon for the admiration of the boarders, and has furnished jokes these 40 years to the young men who show themselves superior to their position by making fun of the dinners to which poverty condemns them. The hearth is always so clean and neat that it is evident that a fire is only kindled there on great occasions. The stone chimney-piece is adorned by a couple of vases filled with faded artificial flowers imprisoned under glass shades, on either side of a bluish marble clock in the very worst taste. The first room exhales an odor for which there is no name in the language, and which should be called the odeur de pension. The damp atmosphere sends a chill through you as you breathe it. It has a stuffy, musty, and rancid quality. It permeates your clothing. After-dinner scents seem to be mingled in it with smells from the kitchen and scullery and the reek of a hospital. It might be possible to describe it if someone should discover a process by which to distill from the atmosphere all the nauseating elements with which it is charged by the catarrhal exhalations of every individual lodger, young or old. Yet, in spite of these stale horrors, the sitting room is as charming and as delicately perfumed as a boudoir. When compared with the adjoining dining room, the paneled walls of that apartment were once painted some color, now a matter of conjecture, for the surface is encrusted with accumulated layers of grimy deposit, which cover it with fantastic outlines. A collection of dim-ribbed glass decanters, metal discs with a satin sheen on them, and piles of blue-edged earthenware plates of Touraine where cover the sticky surfaces of the sideboards that line the room. In a corner stands a box containing a set of numbered pigeonholes, in which the lodgers' table napkins, more or less soiled and stained with wine, are kept. Here you see that indestructible furniture never met with elsewhere, which finds its way into lodging-houses much as the wrecks of our civilization drift into hospitals for incurables. You expect in such places as these to find the weather-house whence a Capuchin issues on wet days. You look to find the execrable engravings which spoil your appetite, framed every one in a black varnished frame, with a gilt beading round it. You know the sort of tortoiseshell clock case, inlaid with brass, the green stove, the argan lamps, covered with oil and dust, have met your eyes before. The oilcloth which covers the long table is so greasy that a waggish extern will write his name on the surface, using his thumbnail as a style. The chairs are broken down invalids. The wretched little hempen mats slip away from under your feet without slipping away for good. And finally, the foot warmers are miserable wrecks, hinchless, charred, broken away about the holes. It would be impossible to give an idea of the old, rotten, shaky, cranky, worm-eaten, halt, maimed, one-eyed, rickety, and ramshackle condition of the furniture without an exhaustive description, which would delay the progress of a story to an extent that impatient people would not pardon. The red tiles of the floor are full of depressions brought about by scouring and periodical renewings of color. In short, there is no illusory grace left to the poverty that reigns here. It is dire, parsimonious, concentrated, threadbare poverty. As yet it has not sunk into the mire. It is only splashed by it, and though not in rags as yet, its clothing is ready to drop to pieces. This apartment is in all its glory at 7 o'clock in the morning, when Madame Walker's cat appears, announcing the near approach of his mistress, and jumps upon the sideboards to sniff at the milk in the bowls, each protected by a plate, while he purrs his morning greeting to the world. A moment later the widow shows her face. She is tricked out in a net cap attached to a false front set on awry, and shuffles into the room in her slipshod fashion. She is an oldish woman, with a bloated countenance, and a nose like a parrot's beak set in the middle of it. Her fat little hands, she is as sleek as a church rat, and her shapeless, slouching figure are in keeping with the room that reeks of misfortune, where hope is reduced to speculate for the meanest stakes. Madame Walker alone can breathe that tainted air without being disheartened by it. Her face is as fresh as a frosty morning in autumn. There are wrinkles about the eyes that vary in their expression from the set smile of a ballet dancer to the dark, suspicious scowl of a discounter of bills. In short, she is at once the embodiment and interpretation of her lodging house, as surely as her lodging house implies the existence of its mistress. You can no more imagine the one without the other than you can think of a jail without a turnkey. The unwholesome corpulence of the little woman is produced by the life she leads, just as typhus fever is bred in the tainted air of a hospital. The very knitted woolen petticoat that she wears beneath a skirt made of an old gown, with the wadding protruding through the rents in the material, is a sort of epitome of the sitting room, the dining room, and the little garden. It discovers the cook. It foreshadows the lodgers. The picture of the house is completed by the portrait of its mistress. Madame Walker at the age of 50 is like all women who have seen a deal of trouble. She has the glassy eyes and innocent air of a trafficker in flesh and blood, who will wax virtuously indignant to obtain a higher price for her services, but who is quite ready to betray a Georges or a Pichegru. If a Georges or a Pichegru were in hiding and still to be betrayed, or for any other expedient that may alleviate her lot. Still, she is a good woman at bottom, said the lodgers, who believed that the widow was wholly dependent upon the money that they paid her, and sympathized when they heard her cough and groan like one of themselves. What had M. Walker been? The lady was never very explicit on this head. How had she lost her money? Through trouble, was her answer. He had treated her badly, had left her nothing but her eyes to cry over his cruelty, the house she lived in, and the privilege of pitying nobody, because, so she was wont to say, she herself had been through every possible misfortune. Sylvie, the stout cook, hearing her mistress' shuffling footsteps, hastened to serve the lodgers' breakfasts. Beside those who lived in the house, Madame Walker took boarders who came for their meals. But these externes usually only came to dinner, for which they paid 30 francs a month. At the time when the story begins, the lodging house contained 7 inmates. The best rooms in the house were on the first story, Madame Walker herself occupying the least important, while the rest were let to
à Madame Couture,
the widow of a commissary general in the service of the Republic, with her lived Victorine Taillefer, a schoolgirl, to whom she filled the place of mother. These 2 ladies paid 1,800 francs a year. The 2 sets of rooms on the second floor were respectively occupied by an old man named Porret and a man of 40 or thereabouts, the wearer of a black wig and dyed whiskers, who gave out that he was a retired merchant and was addressed as M. Vautrin. 2 of the 4 rooms on the third floor were also let, one to an elderly spinster,
à Mademoiselle
Myconneau, and the other to a retired manufacturer of vermicelli, Italian paste and starch, who allowed the others to address him as Father Goriot. The remaining rooms were allotted to various birds of passage, to impecunious students, who, like Father Goriot and Myconneau, could only muster 45 francs a month to pay for their board and lodging. Madame Walker had little desire for lodgers of this sort. They ate too much bread, and she only took them in default of better. At that time one of the rooms was tenanted by a law student, a young man from the neighborhood of Angoulême, one of a large family who pinched and starved themselves to spare 1,200 francs a year for him. Misfortune had accustomed Eugene de Rastignac, for that was his name,
to work.
He belonged to the number of young men who know as children that their parents' hopes are centered on them, and deliberately prepare themselves for a great career, subordinating their studies from the first to this end, carefully watching the indications of the course of events, calculating the probable turn that affairs will take, that they may be the first to profit by them. But for his observant curiosity, and the skill with which he managed to introduce himself into the salons of Paris, this story would not have been colored by the tones of truth which it certainly owes to him, for they are entirely due to his penetrating sagacity and desire to fathom the mysteries of an appalling condition of things, which was concealed as carefully by the victim as by those who had brought it to pass. Above the third story, there was a garret where the linen was hung to dry, and a couple of attics.
Christophe,
The man of all work, slept in one, and Sylvie, the stout cook, in the other. Beside the 7 inmates thus enumerated, taking 1 year with another, some 8 law or medical students dined in the house, as well as 2 or 3 regular comers who lived in the neighborhood. There were usually 18 people at dinner, and there was room, if need be, for 20 at Madame Vauquer's table. At breakfast, however, only the 7 lodgers appeared. It was almost like a family party. Everyone came down in dressing gown and slippers, and the conversation usually turned on anything that had happened the evening before. Comments on the dress or appearance of the dinner contingent were exchanged in friendly confidence. These 7 lodgers were Madame Vauquer's spoiled children. Among them she distributed, with astronomical precision, the exact proportion of respect and attention due to the varying amounts they paid for their board. One single consideration influenced all these human beings thrown together by chance. The 2 second-floor lodgers only paid 72 francs a month. Such prices as these are confined to the Faubourg Saint-Marcel and the district between La Bourbe and the Salpêtrière. And, as might be expected, poverty, more or less apparent, weighed upon them all, Madame Couture being the sole exception to the rule. The dreary surroundings were reflected in the costumes of the inmates of the house. All were alike threadbare. The color of the men's coats were problematical. Such shoes, in more fashionable quarters, are only to be seen lying in the gutter. The cuffs and collars were worn and frayed at the edges. Every limp article of clothing looked like the ghost of its former self. The women's dresses were faded, old-fashioned, dyed and re-dyed. They wore gloves that were glazed with hard wear, much mended lace, dingy ruffles, crumpled muslin fichus. So much for their clothing.
but
For the most part, their frames were solid enough. Their constitutions had weathered the storms of life. Their cold, hard faces were worn like coins that have been withdrawn from circulation. But there were greedy teeth behind the withered lips. Dramas brought to a close or still in progress are foreshadowed by the sight of such actors as these. Not the dramas that are played before the footlights and against a background of painted canvas, but dumb dramas of life. Frostbound dramas that sear hearts like fire. Dramas that do not end with the actors' lives.
Mademoiselle,
Mykono, that elderly young lady, screened her weak eyes from the daylight by a soiled green silk shade with a rim of brass, an object fit to scare away the angel of pity himself. Her shawl, with its scanty, draggled fringe, might have covered a skeleton. So meager and angular was the form beneath it. Yet she must have been pretty and shapely once. What corrosive had destroyed the feminine outlines? Was it trouble? Or vice? Or greed? Had she loved too well? Had she been a second-hand clothes dealer, a frequenter of the back stairs of great houses? Or had she been merely a courtesan? Was she expiating the flaunting triumphs of a youth overcrowded with pleasures by an old age in which she was shunned by every passer-by? Her vacant gaze sent a chill through you. Her shriveled face seemed like a menace. Her voice was like the shrill, thin note of the grasshopper sounding from the thicket when winter is at hand. She said that she had nursed an old gentleman, ill of catarrh of the bladder, and left to die by his children, who thought that he had nothing left. His bequest to her, a life annuity of 1,000 francs, was periodically disputed by his heirs, who mingled slander with their persecutions. In spite of the ravages of conflicting passions, her face retained some traces of its former fairness and fineness of tissue. Some vestiges of the physical charms of her youth still survived. Poiret was a sort of automaton. He might be seen any day sailing like a gray shadow along the walks of the Jardin des Plantes. On his head a shabby cap, a cane with an old yellow ivory handle in the tips of his thin fingers. The outspread skirts of his threadbare overcoat failed to conceal his meager figure. His breeches hung loosely on his shrunken limbs. The thin, blue-stockinged legs trembled like those of a drunken man. There was a notable breach of continuity between the dingy white waistcoat and crumpled shirt frills and the cravat twisted about a throat like a turkey gobbler's. Altogether, his appearance set people wondering whether this outlandish ghost belonged to the audacious race of the sons of Japhet who flutter about on the Boulevard Italian. What devouring kind of toil could have so shriveled him? What devouring passions had darkened that bulbous countenance, which would have seemed outrageous as a caricature? What had he been? Well, perhaps he had been part of the machinery of justice, a clerk in the office to which the executioner sends in his accounts. So much for providing black veils for parricides. So much for sawdust. So much for pulleys and cord for the knife. Or he might have been a receiver at the door of a public slaughterhouse. Or a sub-inspector of nuisances. Indeed, the man appeared to have been one of the beasts of burden in our great social mill. One of those Parisian ratons whom their Bertrands do not even know by sight. A pivot in the obscure machinery that disposes of misery and things unclean. One of those men, in short, at sight of whom we are prompted to remark that, after all, we cannot do without them. Stately Paris ignores the existence of these faces bleached by moral or physical suffering.
But, then,
Paris is in truth an ocean that no line can plumb.